What I'd consider my main army, Adeptus Mechanicus, recently got some new models. The Hastari, which I already tried making different variants of, and Thulia Ghuld, a big new techpriest. So of course I also had to try and build her, but with my own twist. She's also come with a pretty interesting description and role, being an Archmagus Terminus, very high in the techpriest ranks, which is already represented in her size and detail. She's also a member of the Ordo Reductor, a division of the Mechanicus that's more military based, and specifically focused on the destructive power of the machine god's technology. That aspect gave me an idea for what to do with her. To bulk her out with more armour and push the look more in the direction of War Machine, rather than the current delicate tech priest with her thin and intricate upper body details. Something I also noted upon seeing her model reveal, her multi-legged lower section reminded me of the Necron Illuminor Caesarus, which gave me a few other build ideas, like a different way to pose with the staff, and some details to add to the base. With those initial plans, I had enough to start the build for this alternative to Thulia. Maybe not Thulia herself, but another senior tech priest that could fill the same role of an Ordo Reductor Archmagos, by keeping most of the new kit, but changing some visually important parts, like bulking out the silhouette, and altering focal points like the weapons and face. To end up with something that would be more appropriate to join my own custom Forge world, and paint in their orange and grey, instead of being part of Mars in their red robes. To start the building, I assembled all the main parts of the Thulia Mini that I would need for what I had in mind. So the legs, torso, head, and some weapons. For parts to bulk out the upper body, I also picked up the Legions Imperialis Stalker constructs, as there are a few different rounded admech shapes that I could try out, and add some subtle dark mechanical implications. And for some big arms to hold her staff in a new position, I grabbed a pair of larger mechanical ones from the always useful Cataphrone kit. Along with putting her gun on her back, and a Manipulus's Magnum Rail Lance on the end of her staff, this test assembly and sizing up of bits worked, but would need refining a little as I went on. Her big upper body had a lot of room for arms, so I wanted to use her original fleshier pair for a front set, then use the larger ones behind those to hold the staff. That means they need to be bigger to reach forward, so I started to extend the Cataphrone arms. Initially I used some 2mm plastic rod, just to get an idea of the angles for the joints and the length of the parts that were needed. And when I was sure of those, I started swapping in more detailed parts. Similar to my previous big tech priest that I made to work as my admech's Belisarius Call equivalent, I used a few different admech weapon parts, since they're detailed in the same style and are generally the right cylindrical shape. Between the Cataphrone claw, shoulder and elbow, a Doomcrawler autocannon barrel became the main part of the forearm, and the back part of a Cataphrone arc gun became the upper arm. Some of the lower part of the same arc guns worked as a smaller forearm section, along with some 1mm brass wire. And I also opted to use a Titanicus Questoris Knight's Power Fist for this model's right hand, once I bent, cut and re-glued the digits to hold the staff. With that base structure for the arms done, I started trying out parts to add on top for armour, to bulk out the mini like my initial idea. In the end, I went with using some back armour from the Tenebrax Archer Stalker on the forearms. Some armour left over from the Cataphrone arms I hollowed out and cut down to cover up the upper arms. Then the main body panels from the Erax Butcher Stalkers as large shoulders that really build out the model's silhouette. I also wanted to cover the weak flesh of the face, as changing a focal point like that also helps distinguish it from the original model. I tested out using the Tenebrax Archer construct front panel, but in the end I used the optic piece normally held at the side of Thulia's head, just now using it as a multiple eye piece instead. Now those structural and posture defining parts were sorted, I could fit in some of the other important pieces, like mounting the Jericho class conversion resonator on the back. I used more 2mm plastic rod, and a detail round piece left over from one of the Cataphrone arms as the main connector. Then I also used a smaller Cataphrone arm to hold the front, that came out of a hole I cut into one of the carapace details, that looked like it can help aim it. The model's small front right arm is normally typing something into a couple of terminals, but I thought they were a bit too big and might get in the way of swinging the staff, so I instead made a smaller version, using a screen piece from an iron strider held up by part of a Catron arm. To make use of all the space on the shoulders, I added a camera piece taken from a techpriest Dominus's head, which filled the hole on the model's left shoulder, and I added a servo skull from the Battlefield Trophies kit to the right shoulder. The gun still had part of an arm attached to the controls, so to make use of that, I attached one of the servo skulls from the Thulia kit to it, and replaced its plastic wires with a metal wrapped one from Zinja Industries, connecting it to the power pack. I also used a smaller detail taken from the core kit, just to cover up some of Thulia's carapace details I didn't use, as they'd get in the way of the shoulder servo skull. There were still more details to add, but I needed to figure out how much space around the Mini I had to work with, so I made a start on the base. To match Caesarus even more, I thought it would be fun to reverse the factions and have this model using the bottom of the staff to electrocute a Necron on the base. So I cut up a spare Necron warrior to reassemble it crawling away, minus a body part here or there. For some surface to mount it all on, I used a layer of corkboard, which makes for a nice slightly raised platform to make this character stand out just a little more. Once I tore up the corkboard to roughly match the round plastic base, I traced the shape onto some double diamond pattern plasticard and glued that on top, to match the industrial setting of the Forge World. I also left a space in the corkboard layer to put some 3mm plastic pipes in, to partially expose to add an extra dimension to the base, as well as represent the partially destroyed state of my custom admech Forge World. With that all arranged on the base and pinned to where it all fits best, I knew where else I could add details on the main model without them being too far out and in harm's way. On one side of the lower body, to cover where the model normally holds some ammo, I made a sensor arm, which was a detail I liked from my core. Given it broke off on that previous model, I used sturdy wrapped wire to attach the Cataphrone servo arm and spherical sensor piece from a Skitaris power pack. On the other side, to make use of another unused part connection point, I attached a servo skull taken from the Battlefield Trophies kit. To make sure this one was also sturdy, I bent some 1mm brass rod to dangle slightly, and I also attached a mechadendrite weapon arm from the Erax Butcher construct, to help the servo skull disassemble the down Necron he's pointed at. Then I could get to the important step for any admech kitbash, adding a mess of wires. I started off with some 1 and 2mm wrapped wire to sturdily attach the gun at a few points. Then I mixed up some green stuff, first into balls, which were rolled out into plain wires. Then I used my Green Stuff World Rollmaker set to imprint a few different patterns, before adding them to the model. I used these to fill in gaps, link up parts, add detail to spaces that were too plain, and to go along with some other wires like on the servo skulls. I made sure to connect the gun to the power pack at multiple points to emphasise the power needed for such a strong weapon. And to add an extra level of detail, I used some 1mm strips of masking tape to bundle together a few groups of wires, and sealed the ends of that with a small drop of superglue. Incorporating more of the Stalker construct kit, I used some weapon barrels from it, one to replace a section of the staff, and another to work as an antennae to fill a gap on the back of the right shoulder. Getting back to the base, I had previously used a small one-off build to test out making arcing electricity effects. The 0.5mm brass rods I tried ended up being a little too thick, so this time I used the smallest ones I could find, some 0.3mm. I used tweezers to bend a lot of angles into them, and glued them into holes of the same size I drilled on the bottom of the staff, and on the Necron. For a few more base details, I added a destroyed Gauss gun to go with the Necron, and different types of wire to trail on top and come out of one of the pipes. I also made some rubble chunks, similar to the base, torn up corkboard, textured plasticard, with some army painter razor wire glued in to work as rebar. I scattered those around empty parts of the base, and also tried to build them out of the model's existing rubble foot stand to blend it all in a bit better. With that, the building was done, so I could get to painting it to match the rest of my converted admech army with their silver, copper, grey and orange scheme. I started by priming it black, then heavily dry brushing it all with the dark silver iron warriors. This is a great way to do the main part of the model quickly, while still leaving the recesses darker like it's already been shaded. I followed that up with a lighter dry brush of the brighter Surcoat Silver from Tooth & Coats, to give the more raised areas a rough highlight. From there I moved to regularly painting the other parts. Starting with using mechanicus standard grey for all the robes, then I used Thulia Ghuld for all the armour trim and metallic details, then ratskin flesh for the robe sleeves and a few wires just to introduce more orange to the model. I used corn red and cabalite green for a few more wires, Rakarth flesh for the skulls and skin, then Celestra grey and grey sear to prepare some areas I want to have a brighter, almost glowing look I achieved with the later step of adding contrast paints. In particular, the inner parts of the staff and gun, along with the brass rod electricity, which I want to be blue, were prepared with Celestra grey, and all the other parts, like screen and some secondary optics, were painted with grey sear. Specifically for the staff and gun, I thinned down the Celestra grey, so the paint settled more in the recesses, to make it look like the grey was seeping out from within, and I went over the more raised areas with silver again. For the actual contrasts, I used Athematic blue over Celestra grey for the blue of the main eyes, energy weapon parts, and a few other optics and glow-in sections. I used Eandan yellow and Blood Angels red for some other optics, Crandras green for the little screen and some parts of the Necron on the base, and for a non-glowing contrast part, I used Black Templar to darken some already metallic parts, like some of the wires for even more variety in their colours. Then it was time to shade it, using washes to add darker shadows. Roughly matching the colours, I used the black Nuln Oil on the silver and grey parts, then the brown Agrax Earthshade on the copper, orange, red and beige parts, which included all the skulls and flesh of the arms. To paint the base, I dry brushed most of it with Iron Warriors, along with the main mini at the start of the painting, and I went over all the corkboard with Eshin Grey. On top of that grey, I added some Pro Acryl Fine Grey Earth for rougher earth and debris texture. Once that dried, it got roughly dry brush highlighted with some warmer grey beiges of Storm Vermin fur and a bit of Rakarth flesh. I tried to do some lazy OSL, object source lighting, to make it look like the arcing electricity was partially lighting the area around it. I dry brushed it and the immediate area around it with Baharoth blue, trying to brush in directions outwards of the electricity. After that, I did the same but a bit more lightly with Celestra grey, and for some final very bright points on the electricity itself, I dry brushed some bold titanium white. As expected from dry brushing whites, it was a little dusty, but it worked as a great shortcut for some simple lighting effects. I just did also later edge highlight the same paints for a few small nearby spots I missed. After that I shaded the base, mostly with Agrax Earthshade, but I did also scatter in a few drops of Nuln Oil and Reikland Flesh Shade too for a little variety. I also thinned the washes way more in the area around the electricity so that part remained brighter. And for one more small effect on the base, that's something I wanted to do but ended up leaving out for my core techpriest, was some oil spilling out from one of the broken pipes. I used some UV resin that I added to the base, holding it at an angle so it didn't spill off. I poked it into the right places with some spare paperclip wire, and solidified it with some UV light. After I let it sit in some sunlight for a day to fully cure, I added some gloss black, and finally a few coats of Turbo Dork Skyrat, a type of paint where its colour shifts depending on what angle the light hits it, similar to how an oil slick has various colours. Finally, to finish the painting off, I got to highlighting the model. For some colours, just using the original paint to brighten raised areas and edges after the washes, and for more prominent colours, I used a brighter shade of the paint, sometimes even mixing an intermediate colour using the original paint to make sure it transitions smoothly to the brightest, most raised parts. Along with the previously listed base coat paints, I used Surcoat Silver for the silver, Hashut Copper for the coppers, and both Dawnstone and a small bit of grey sear for the many folds, layers and edges of the grey robes. And that's how I made this custom Ordo Reductor Archmagos, using the new admech character, working in some dark mechanicus bits to emphasise some lore, and also taking inspiration from a different factions mini that I liked. Along with the Histari, these are all the new admech units joining my own custom Forge World in their kitbashed forms. But there's still a few more units that need kitbashing I want to get around to. And there's still a mech build I was in the middle of before the admech units released that I need to get back to. But before those, there are some Armageddon Marines I'm turning into Black Templars to join my crusading forces. If you want to see that building before the eventual video, check out my social media pages, like on Instagram and Twitter, linked to in the description. If you want to try something like this build yourself, I've linked to the main kits using my Element Games affiliate link, and if you'd like to support me more directly, you can check out my Patreon, where I post weekly project updates, future build ideas, building tips that anyone can check out, and more. Thank you for watching, and a special thanks to my current Patreon supporters, who are Kyra, Morsgonefree, Gamrus, The Lich's Laboratory, Always Able, Nariko the Transbian Shark, B-Dog, Darren, Quirky Perceptions, Red Wolf, Yaroslav Altunen, Robbie Nito, and Samuel Brewis.